such a hands-on sort of thing. You really feel like, I feel like you're really shaping things in real time, and you have this physical interaction with the instrument where you can almost tell a story in a way, just by your hands, and following and intuitively picking up on things and interacting with it in a way where certain actions and events happen. Oh, well, that's cool. Go with that. Turn that to a transition, and the way I've designed this patch, the creature patch was my sort of approach to doing music, concrete style music with a modular synth, and so I'm a huge fan of academic electroacoustic music, and some of that is they do actually use some modular synthesizers and field recordings and computer synthesis. It's pretty much an open palette, use whatever, but I felt to just do really interesting gestures and clusterings and modulation layers of sound. The modular synth is really great for that. And the shared system in particular was really, really fun to apply that sort of perspective and approach to this sort of free-form composition on the fly, so to speak, is what I call it. Because basically, just running this patch, I could leave it, but it won't really do anything. It'll just sit in kind of at an idle stage without me directing and conducting where it should go. Which is actually quite different than how I patch with my other systems in my studio. My other modular systems, I will set up a patch that's self-sequencing and mutating and changing over time and doing all these things, and then I just leave it. There's no hands interaction with the patch. And I love that too, because you basically create what I call this floating, a little electrical organism that's moving around in this little neural network that you made. And it just floats in that space for that one time. It's like this little ghost that you have. You're like, oh, like I just recorded it, like I'm just like, I find it's a fascinating sort of feeling you get that I've not really experienced with any other instrument I've ever played, no matter how hard I was tripping. It's very hard to explain. Once you start getting, you have this sort of personal connection to it that's kind of hard to explain. Once you get a patch and you figure all the intricacies of it, then it'll never be the same. You'll never get the same thing ever, and that's what's so beautiful about it. You're going to always get something new, and it doesn't get old as time goes on. You'll constantly find new ways to patch it and reconfigure it and come up with these sounds you've never heard before.
Could I ask you, for the sake of time and to completely simplistic description I gave you folks about how some of these modules work.
Yeah.
We pick out just one. I mean, obviously there's, if you look at this, I mean, there's just a massive number of patches happening in this particular system. I mean, there's a lot of cables here, but if you could pick perhaps one process that's going on.
Sure.
And maybe explain it to these folks what it's doing exactly, and if you could isolate it from everything else. I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah.
It's just one process. Like, say, how are you using a step random voltage that we talked about earlier?
Right. Tony was talking about the step random. You heard that kind of computery step. I'm actually using that to do strange things here. So I use the Woggle Bug, as you can see me tweaking this a lot. The Woggle Bug was doing a lot of the clustering of different notes. I'm using it basically like a crude sequencer, or clock, I should say, and sequencer, because it's triggering the Renee to sequence. And it's generating some CV out on the sept out, which is basically going into one of the 1 volt per octave voices on.
Remember, that was when I was controlling the pitch.
The pitch of the
DPO.
And as Tony was explaining with his demonstration, he was talking about using sine waves. For this patch, that's all I'm using is 2 sine waves. So everything that you're hearing was just modulation, frequency modulation is also another thing that you went into. I find that you could almost make any sound with just sine waves. I discovered that early on using sine waves with computers, messing around with C-Sound and some of these other additive synthesis applications you could control large partial groups of sine waves. But with this, it's great because I'm using the sept out there, and then I'm also using the the CV out, what are the CV outputs of the grenade to trigger the other CV input of the other sound wave. So I'm basically having one source kind of do its random thing on one sound, but the other one's doing a completely different thing. So I'm actually trying to create more complexity out of just using these two oscillators. But then I'm interplaying that with the modulation, the FM modulation. Getting it here in the center here. I'm like driving that up the blue knob and was changing that quite a bit to change the sort of, as it's sequenced, if you're going from either to high notes or to low notes, the modulation is going to sound different. It's going to add a lot more timbre and kind of rusticness to the way that the waves are moving around, especially when they're getting CV signals that are iterated at different rates, whether they're long or low notes where I'm holding stuff. So you're going to, I'm basically trying to get as much, I don't know how to explain it, trying to get as much flexibility out of the oscillator as I can by using as many control sources and as much modulation as possible. And that's basically what I'm using the DPO for. And that's basically my only sound source that I'm using. And then from that, I take one of the voices out of that, I'm going into the echophone, which you were hearing a lot of the sort of tape feedback effect stuff that was going on. And then the other voice output.
And that's whenever you hear a sound that kind of repeats.
It's repeating
over and over again.
It kind of swells
It's
up.
kind of capturing it in the echo and letting it play over and over again until he decides he wants another sound, and then you're kind of wiping that out and putting a new sound in there. Is that what you're doing?
Exactly. It's very similar to what you're explaining there. And then you're probably noticing I have a couple guitar pedals up here, and these are nothing complicated. This is a Strymon Blue Sky reverb pedal, and all I'm doing is, well, it's funny, what I'm actually doing with the echophone is it's got a really unique feature out here. You've got a feedback out. It's kind of like a send and return on a mixer if you're going to send to like an effects processor, like on a Mackie or. What I'm doing here is I'm actually sending and feeding it the aux send and return to a reverb unit. And what I'm doing is I'm catching just enough of this mix to cause this sort of feedback hum to come back into the echophone. So as you were hearing parts, you would hear parts where you hear this feedback tone slowly creep in. So what I'm doing is I'm just sending a little bit more signal from the echophone to the Blue Sky reverb to catch this sort of wash, to drench that feedback, to give it this sort of ghostly, haunting kind of a sound. And I would do it at different levels. The more I send to it, the more of a different tone you get, depending on what's going through the echophone at the time. It might be a low tone. So if it catches it on a low tone and I feedback it, just I think you're going to get a low feedback drone. If I get a high note, it'll be a high note drone coming back. And so you've got a lot of flexibility. What you just catch for that second, hold that feedback delay, let it kind of creep in, and then you ease that. And then you kind of change it as you go. So I use it more as like a drone maker.
If I could interrupt 1 minute. So, folks, typically when you see a reverb stomp box, someone's just going to have it at the end of a signal chain or something and applying reverb to their entire sound. Like a guitar player playing into a reverb pedal, or a singer putting reverb on a singer's voice. I think what's interesting about that use is you're not applying reverb to the whole sound coming out of the system. You're only applying reverb to what's in the feedback
chain. Right. So I'm trying to get different, I guess, the widest available varieties of feedback tones that I can using this as my feedback enhancer in a way. And I experimented with this too. You don't necessarily have to use reverb. I have found that I actually set up another patch at home where I had a signal chain using it was the IntelliGel mixer where I had different sources. I had a ring mod, I had a frequency shifter. I tried several different sources that I ran the feedback chain out to and then ran it back in. And each device that I ran it through gave me a totally different sound of feedback coming in. So I'd have like a ring modulated sort of feedback sound, frequency shifted sort of ring sound coming in. The timbres and the different frequencies and modulation, weird things you hear coming back in would always be kind of different. And I would just flip through different signal switches and feed them back in. It's like, oh, this is really cool. I mean, if I had another case, I would dedicate a whole case just to how my feedback would come back in, just playing with that whole idea. But it's fun. Like, there's no, like, another thing to remember is that there's no right or wrong.
contrary to what a lot of people think, you actually, at least in this system here, you can't blow anything up with patches.
It's very subjective.
That's a really common thing with people who are just getting started. They're very concerned. Well, my patch is here. Everything's going to go to hell. There's going to be smoke and...
It's like people, I guess, have like the mastering mentality where when they master music, there's these rigid rules of like how like the track should be mastered. Many people argue about what equipment should be used. Should you brick wall limit the whole mix, or should you leave some headroom or whatever? Like there's people, I guess, come from this older school mentality music industry. There's these rules and things that you can do things wrong. It's gonna sound really bad, or you're gonna end up with a, But here there is no sounding bad. That's what's so fun about it. It kind of brings the whole. I got into making music because shit's fun. I have fun doing it, and this playful aspect of it, of experimenting, coming up with new sounds, and kind of I think that's what really makes it so special. There is no rules. You sit down and you just do what you feel is you, what you like to hear, and
right. If you pulled those patch cables out of that system right there, it would do absolutely nothing.
Nothing. That's true. Yeah, and like I said earlier, I like to patch many different ways. Sometimes I like to do these self-contained patches that they do their own. It's like a regenerative patch where it regenerates sequence values and stuff, and you don't have to do anything. You can just listen to it for hours. And you don't touch a thing. And then sometimes I like doing this, where the patch won't do anything unless you do something.
Unless you kick it in the ass.
Kick it in the ass a little bit, So it's so fun. No matter what approach you have or what angle you come at it, there's no right or wrong. It's all subjective. It's all what you want to do, and your way is the right way. There's no.
On that note, because and one of the things that was so interesting about the show last night, I thought, was how different all three of the performances were. And on that note, I think it's a perfect time to segue over here to Rob's patch, which this is I don't know if it's an exact recreation, but it's
close.
It's close. Okay.
The pitches are slightly different, and the tempo is slightly different from the other.
Sure. As you may or may not know, Richard recorded a Shared System Series record, and so did Rob. It's not out yet. I did send all the files out. So supposedly you are pressing them soon. I thought what was really interesting about last night is how different these two artists sound using very similar tools. And so maybe we can get you to show off this patch a little bit to these folks and tell them a little bit about your process. I think it'll be very interesting for them to see both the similarities and the differences in how you two do what you do.
Well, that's one thing that I think is really wonderful about modular synthesis is you can have, like with the Shared System Series, we're all using the exact same system, the exact same modules that do the exact same things. But,
even the same time restrictions.
Exactly. But how we apply those tools individually are wildly different. And that's one thing that's really amazing to me about modular synthesis is you build your own tool from the ground up. You build your own system. Because for years, I've been interested in synthesis for many, many years since I was very young. And I love the sound of like a mini Moog or an Art Odyssey, and these hardwired synthesizers with these keyboard controllers. And after a while, it got to the point where I realized that it wasn't enough because there are these limitations, and I do like parameters. I think parameters are really great. I like being boxed in and figuring a way out of that box. And that's the great challenge specifically about this series. Because I've been for years using modular synthesizers and trying different modules from different companies that do wildly different things. And having a system, sort of going back to the idea of having a system that is made by one company that does one thing, but breaking out of that, and the fact that you have the possibility to do that the way you would patch one module to another. And just the idea of the organic nature of it, they're extremely sensitive machines, and people think, oh, it's got wires and circuits and blinking lights and it can make these sort of harsh, cold sounds, but it makes very warm sounds, and it's all based on electricity, and so are we. And that's the thing that I really love about it is it is an organism, and it's living, and you have a dialogue with it. The electricity that it gives out, you put back into it, and vice versa. It just continues this cycle. And each module individually has its own function. It does its own thing. And when you patch one into another, they have a conversation. They start to have this dialogue, and they say, oh, well, I'm doing this, and I'd like you to do this now. And so it's kind of wonderful and magical to me that, that's a possibility. So, with this patch is quite a bit simpler than Richard's patch.
There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. No, there's no right or wrong.
No, absolutely, and like you said, there's no right or wrong, and that's the other great thing about it, and